Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to help you get quickly up to speed on, well, sometimes pretty complex topics.
Exactly. And today we're continuing our journey through the patent world.
Yes, specifically our series trying to make the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure, the MPP, a bit more accessible. Whether you're prepping for the patent bar, you're already practicing, or maybe just curious about how patents actually get examined.
Right. And this whole series, it's about breaking down specific sections. Today we're hitting a really core part of the examination process itself.
We're looking at MPP Section 704, that's in Chapter 700, which is all about the examination of applications.
And Section 704 covers two really critical things. First, the examiner's job searching for prior art.
And second, maybe less obvious, the rules around when the examiner can actually ask you, the applicant, for information.
Yeah, it defines the examiner's responsibilities and also the applicant's duties to provide facts when needed.
So our mission today is to really unpack both of those, the search and the information requests, so you get a feel for the whole picture from both sides. Okay, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So starting with that examiner's search responsibility, what's the absolute first thing an examiner does when they get an application?
Well, according to MPP Section 704, their first big task is to conduct a prior art search. But, and this is really key, they're supposed to do this after they've really tried to thoroughly understand the invention that's actually disclosed in the application.
So understanding comes first, before the search.
Absolutely. Understanding the invention is like prerequisite number one. You can't find what's relevant if you don't know what you're looking for.
Makes total sense. But what if the application isn't perfectly written? Maybe it's a bit informal or seems incomplete. Does the examiner just wait?
That's a great practical point. The MP is pretty clear here. Even if the application isn't, perfectly drafted, the examiner still has to perform a meaningful search.
A meaningful search. Why that specific term?
Well, the idea behind it is crucial. They really want to avoid something called fragmented examination.
Fragmented examination. Okay, what's bad about that?
It's inefficient. If an examiner doesn't do a solid search up front covering the main ideas, you might get issues popping up way later in the process, issues that really should have been dealt with from the start.
Right, so it draws things out, makes the whole back and forth the prosecution take longer.
Exactly. A meaningful search up front means the examiner tackles the most relevant stuff early on.
Okay, got it. So a solid initial search is the goal. What if, say, an application gets passed from one examiner to another? Does the new examiner just start over?
Good question. If a new examiner takes over, they don't just, accept the previous search without looking. They do need to review that prior search, check if it looks thorough enough.
Uh-huh.
However, the guidance strongly discourages them from completely restarting the whole search from scratch, unless there's a really compelling reason.
Compelling reason. Like what? What would count?
It's not spelled out exhaustively, but you can imagine things like maybe a major amendment that completely changes what the invention claims are about.
Okay.
Or maybe new issues come up that just weren't considered before. Or perhaps it becomes clear the first search was, obviously way too limited or missed a critical area based on new information that came to light.
So restarting is definitely the exception.
Right.
Not the rule.
Okay. So the examiner understands the invention. They figure out the search scope. Where do they actually look for this prior art? What are the sources?
The search is pretty broad, actually. MPEP Section 900 gives some detail on this. They look at different kinds of prior art, definitely U.S. patents. That includes utility, design, plant patents, and also published U.S. applications.
Right.
Then there are foreign patent documents. And also, importantly, what's called non-patent literature, or NPL.
NPL. That's things like scientific papers, technical manuals, conference proceedings, stuff outside the patent databases.
Yeah.
Exactly that kind of thing. And the search isn't just limited to exactly what's in the claims. It should cover the claim's subject matter, sure, but also other features disclosed in the application that relate to the core inventive concept.
So even things mentioned in the description but not claimed yet.
Potentially, yes. The examiner tries to prioritize areas where they think they're most likely to find the really relevant art. It's about being efficient, but also effective.
And they also search the application itself, right? The stuff the applicant submitted.
Oh, absolutely. The applicant's own disclosure, the description, the claims, the drawings, is a primary source for understanding.
Makes sense.
Though with drawings, sometimes if details needed for understanding aren't actually shown properly, the examiner might object. There are rules for that, like 37 CFR 1.83a. It might mean the applicant needs to provide better drawings.
And what about things like sequence listings in biotech?
Yeah, those have very specific requirements too for searching and just for filing in general. That's covered elsewhere in the MP.
Okay, here's something that kind of jumped out at me from the source material. It mentioned that sometimes even unpublished, abandoned applications might be searched. How does that work?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It happens in specific situations. Usually it's if that unpublished abandoned application is somehow identified or relied upon in another document that is public, like a later published patent or application.
So it's a way to access relevant information that might otherwise be hidden in the USPTO's files.
Pretty much. It's a mechanism to make sure important context isn't missed just because an earlier related application was abandoned before publication. It shows how deep the search can go if necessary.
Wow, okay. The search is definitely comprehensive, so that covers the examiner's active search duty. But MPP Section 704 has this whole other major part. The USPTO requiring information from the applicant. This is where things get really interesting, like you said.
It does feel like the tables turn a bit, yeah. This part is mostly governed by a specific rule, 37 CFR 1.105. The basic idea is that examiners can formally ask for factual information.
Factual information.
Right, but only if that information is considered reasonably necessary for the proper examination of the application.
Who are they asking? Just the inventor.
They can ask the applicant, which could be the inventor, or maybe a company if the invention was assigned. They can also ask the inventor directly or the assignee directly.
Okay, so reasonably necessary factual information. What kind of things are we talking about? Give me some examples.
Sure. The MPP gives quite a few. They might ask about prior art searches that you, the applicant or inventor, have already done.
Why would they ask that?
Because often, your specific field, your competitors, the existing solutions, may be better than anyone initially. So your knowledge of the prior art landscape can be really helpful.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
They could ask you to point out specific non-patent literature, like key articles or maybe commercial databases relevant to your technology that you're aware of. Or, and this is quite interesting, they might ask for explanations about how certain references were used. Maybe references you cited yourself, or even ones the examiner found. How did they factor into your invention process, or maybe even how you drafted the claims?
Why does how I used a reference matter to them?
Think about obviousness. If you knew about reference A, and you specifically designed your invention to solve a problem that reference A had, or if reference A actually taught away from your solution.
That context helps the examiner figure out if my invention would have been obvious or not.
Exactly. That factual background about your process can be really relevant to the patentability analysis, especially for obviousness under Section 103.
Okay, so when does this usually happen? When would an examiner feel the need to ask for this kind of help?
The MPP gives a couple of good scenarios. One big one is in really fast-moving or emerging tech fields.
Like AI or certain biotech areas, maybe?
Could be. If the technology is so new that the standard classification systems examiners use to search, like the USPC or CPC systems, aren't really built out yet for that specific niche, well, the examiner might not have the best tools to find the art.
So they turn to the applicant who's actually in that field for leads.
Precisely. Your insight into where the relevant art might actually be found could be critical in those cases.
Okay, what's another scenario?
Another one is simply if the examiner does their standard search, using all the usual techniques, and just doesn't find much highly relevant prior art.
Really? That happens.
It can. In that situation, they might come back to the applicant and ask things like, do you know of anyone else using this invention? Are there competing products out there? Can you provide any other technical context that might affect whether this is patentable, especially obviousness?
But wait, does this mean the applicant suddenly has to go out and do a bunch of extra research for the examiner? Like become a detective?
No, and that's a really crucial point. The rule is very clear. Applicants are not expected to conduct new research just because the examiner asked.
Okay, that's important. So what is the obligation then?
The obligation is to respond in good faith. You need to provide the information based on what you already know, or what you could reasonably find out from your own records and existing knowledge.
Good faith, based on what you know. What if you honestly don't know the answer, or you just don't have that information readily available?
The MPP anticipates that. It says that usually a simple statement explaining that saying the requested information isn't known or isn't readily available will be enough.
Okay, so you don't have to invent answers.
Definitely not. Honesty and good faith are key.
Got it. What other kinds of specific information might they ask for beyond just prior art leads?
Well, they might ask for copies of technical articles or literature that the inventors actually referred to when they were developing the invention.
Oh.
Or maybe journal articles the inventors themselves wrote that relate to the technology. They could also ask for identification of any related patent applications, like earlier provisionals, or maybe parent applications, continuations, divisionals,
Why ask about related applications?
to make sure the whole picture is clear, that relationships are properly claimed, and that disclosures in those related cases are considered. It's about consistency and ensuring all relevant history is on the table.
Okay. Anything
Yeah,
else?
one more important one. They can ask for your comments on how the examiner is interpreting specific terms in your claims.
So asking for my take on claim construction.
Essentially, yes. Getting clarity on claim meaning is fundamental, right? Because that's what gets compared against the prior art. So sometimes they need your input on what a term means in the context of your invention.
That makes sense. Now, what about timing? When do these requests typically show up?
Technically, an examiner can issue a requirement for information at pretty much any point during the prosecution, the back and forth.
But is there a preferred time?
Yes. The MPP calls out the best practice, which is to issue these requirements either before the first main rejection, the first office action on the merits, or with it.
Why then?
It gets all the necessary factual context established early. It avoids delays later if this information turns out to be important.
What if a request comes much later, like after several rejections?
If it comes later in the game, it still needs to have a clear purpose related to the ongoing examination. It shouldn't just be a random request. It needs to help resolve outstanding issues.
Okay. And what happens if an applicant gets one of these and they just ignore it? Or maybe they send back an incomplete answer.
That's a really critical point for applicants and their representatives. You must provide replies that are both complete and timely.
And if you don't?
Failure to provide a full and timely response to a proper requirement for information can actually lead to the application being declared abandoned.
Wow. Okay. So it's serious. You have to respond properly.
Absolutely. It's tied to that duty of candor and good faith you have before the USPTO. And just to balance that, the examiner also has a duty.
Which is?
If you do provide the information, the examiner is required to fully consider everything you submitted in your reply. They can't just ignore it.
Right. So zooming out again, this whole mechanism, this 37 CFR 1.105, it's not just about making life difficult for applicants.
No, not at all. The stated purpose, the reason it exists, is explicitly to enhance the quality of examination.
How does it do that?
By allowing the examiner to get essential factual information and context directly from the people who often know the invention and its technical field best, the inventors and applicants. It helps the examiner make a more informed and hopefully better decision on patentability.
Which ideally leads to stronger, more reliable patents in the end.
That's the goal.
So let's bring this back to you, the listener. If you're studying this stuff, maybe for the patent bar, or you're a practitioner or an inventor, what are the big takeaways from MPPP Section 704?
Well, I think understanding how the examiner approaches their search is fundamental. It gives you a better sense of what kind of art they might uncover and why. It kind of demystifies that part of the process.
And knowing about these information requirements under 1.105.
That's just crucial for actually prosecuting an application effectively. You need to be prepared for the possibility of receiving one. Understand your obligation is to provide known, factual information in good faith.
Right. Being ready for that, being transparent when asked, can probably make the whole examination smoother.
Absolutely. It can definitely impact the process and the outcome. It really highlights that patent examination isn't just the examiner working in isolation.
It's more interactive.
Yeah, it requires that input, that interaction, that good faith cooperation from the applicant side too, to really get the best examination quality possible. It's a shared responsibility in a way.
Okay, well, that pretty much wraps up our deep dive into MPP Section 704, the examiner's search, and the requirements for information. Hopefully that sheds some light on these key examination steps.
And before we go, we really want to give a special thank you to Mike Shepard. He's the creative director who put this whole MPEP audio series together for everyone.
Yes, thank you, Mike. So here's a final thought for you to consider, building on what we discussed. We know the examiner has to search, but we also know they can ask you for critical facts, like prior art you already found or how you used certain references. How does acknowledging this shared responsibility of the examiner's search, plus your potential input, kind of redefine how we establish what's truly new and patentable? Does it shift things beyond just relying solely on the examiner's ability to find everything? Something to think about.
This summary of the MPEP was generated using AI tools, including ChatGPT and NotebookLM, and may contain errors or omissions. It is provided for general educational and informational purposes only, and is not legal advice or a substitute for formal instruction. For authoritative guidance, consult the official MPEP, a qualified instructor, or a registered patent practitioner.